Winter is in full swing, and the war shows no signs of abating. The arrival of a new fighting season has pundits, commentators, armchair generals, and experts all asking the same question. With winter in full swing, how will the combatants cope? Join us today as we explore the realities of general winter and gauge just how the Ukrainian and Russian war machines will adapt. Wars don't stop with the arrival of winter. Falling snow and freezing temperatures invariably affect the tempo of military operations. Nowhere is this truer than in Eastern Europe, where grueling fighting continues over occupied territory in the eastern Luhansk and Donetsk regions. Losses on both sides have been tremendous so far. But it has been a successful year-end wrap-up for Ukraine, having consolidated massive gains in Kharkiv and Kherson. Fast-paced, kinetic operations are continuing as the ground freezes over. What then can we expect as winter draws on? Neither side is a stranger to winter warfare. Despite the fact many conscripts and volunteer fighters are set to endure the first winter on the front lines, both sides have technically been sparring over eastern Ukraine since 2014. As such, a great many veterans have endured consecutive winters holding the line in this region and are more than capable of battling their enemy and the brutal winter conditions. They are far from the first soldiers to do so. Historically, the surrounding region has played host to many notable winter encounters, none more famous than Napoleon's disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812, which, after losing 5/6 of his army to attrition, disease, and desertion, suffered immense privation on his winter retreat from Moscow. Another authoritarian dictator a century later probably should have taken note. Authorizing a shocking invasion of the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, Adolf Hitler's bloody campaign famously stalled near Moscow as winter set in. With casualty rates climbing into the millions, the Soviets traded territory for time, enabling them to counterattack and hold the Germans at bay. Thereafter, the campaign devolved into a grinding war of attrition with no end in sight. Sound familiar? Hoping to defeat the Soviets before year's end, the Germans were utterly unprepared for the changing seasons and failed to equip their soldiers and vehicles with warm clothing and winterized lubricants accordingly, an entirely preventable outcome which resulted in unimaginable losses. It's hard to adequately describe the granular degree to which winter can complicate military operations. Karl von Clausewitz, the renowned Prussian military theorist and contemporary of Napoleon, perhaps said it best, describing the phenomenon of battlefield friction, or the unforeseen difficulties that inevitably arise during combat. He famously quipped, "Everything is very simple in war, but even the simplest thing is difficult." This is winter warfare in a nutshell. The days get shorter, the nights get longer. Soldiers must remain outdoors for long periods of time, patrolling, observing, and vigilantly scanning the horizon. Temperatures dip to painfully cold levels. Harsh wind stings exposed extremities until they go numb, cutting through winter shells, fleeces, and other layers of insulation. All this time outdoors puts you at risk for hypothermia and frostbite, and so hot meals and liquids to stave off hunger and dehydration are a must. Low temperatures also wreak havoc on firearms, causing jams, feed issues, or misfires, to say nothing of vehicles that are hard to start in the cold. For tracked and wheeled vehicles, maneuverability is far better in snow than mud, where getting stuck is an omnipresent reality. For the unlucky dismounted infantry, whenever temperatures dip below freezing, you have to be cautious. After all, it's easy to slip and injure yourself on the ice. Ukraine can reach 40 below on the coldest of nights, but more often than not, soldiers won't need to endure such extreme conditions. Average winter temperatures in Ukraine tend to hover just over freezing, which is arguably worse. In this type of wet cold, rain and snow coexist, making even the simplest daily routines miserable and the battlefield notoriously difficult to navigate. Ukraine is far better equipped to do so if battlefield correspondents, social media, and expert analysts are to be trusted. They have received and continue to receive winter clothing, meals, tents, fuel, and other equipment to help them adapt to the slower pace of fighting as part of the most recent round of military aid packages. Ukraine has claimed it hopes to provide adequate winter equipment to 200,000 soldiers. NATO estimated almost half of these needs had already been met by early September. By early December, Canada had sent more than 500,000 winter uniforms alone. The US had sent hundreds of power generators and an assortment of cold weather gear. Britain more than 195,000 winter clothing items. More has come from an array of Scandinavian and Baltic NATO countries quietly but effectively buttressing Ukraine's war effort. These efforts are designed to assist soldier and civilian alike, especially as the latter suffered renewed missile attacks on energy infrastructure and power stations, a clear, if downright cruel tactic employed by the Kremlin to brutalize the civilian population as its troops continue to suffer defeats on the battlefield. With NATO, Western defense officials and global charities catering their donations to help Ukrainians endure months of harsh freezing weather, they seem to be faring better than their Russian counterparts, whose own shoddy equipment, logistical frailties, and insufficient winter gear continues to invite derision, scorn, and shock worldwide. Make no mistake, winter does not discriminate between belligerents. It will be hard on both sides. But while Ukrainian forces, bolstered by a recent unexpected visit to the front by their commander-in-chief, President Volodymyr Zelensky, enjoyed widespread domestic support and remained committed to their national cause, the lightly equipped Russians, whose tenuous lines of supply are constantly targeted by ambitious Ukrainian gunners, have been forced to defend hastily dug trench networks and ad hoc fortifications. According to Catherine Stepanenko, a Russian analyst at the Institute for the Study of War, intercepted calls and radio transmissions indicate a general lack of thermal underwear and other winter necessities, wet, cold troops, and low morale. There is a general lack of body armor, knee pads, and quality helmets. Certain reports claim the situation is so dire, Russia has been forced to violate UN sanctions by furnishing certain troops with winter uniforms and underwear produced in North Korean garment factories. There are rising desertion rates. Commanders don't want to dig in and hold shoulder to shoulder with the conscripts under their purview, some abandoning their soldiers altogether. While much of the front lines have become static and defensive, fighting has intensified in and around Bakhmut, a bloody vortex at the center of Ukraine's fight against the Russian invaders reduced to rubble by perpetual shelling, mortar fire, and intense urban skirmishes. Russia is firing an estimated 20,000 artillery rounds per day in a desperate bid to cling to territory occupied months ago. 3 to 5 times as many rounds expended by Ukraine. Cover is sparse. There are no trees or buildings left standing in this hellhole of a war zone. Troops must fire and remain mobile under threat of near-immediate counterfires. At the sound of an airplane overhead or incoming shell fire, soldiers crowd into cramped underground bunkers and trenches, awaiting a silence that never seems to come. These tense moments can be brutal. Movement is constricted, temperatures low, and shivering common. Much of this fighting is purely tactical, seemingly random, overwhelmingly chaotic engagements over small, bitterly contested patches of territory. Drones have featured prominently throughout the conflict, giving combatants a relatively safe set of eyes to observe their enemies from afar. Winter significantly reduces the duration of drone overflights as lithium polymer batteries notoriously suffer poor performance in the cold, sometimes in the region of 50% faster battery depletion. Older Soviet-era alkaline batteries powering many Russian vehicles lose an average of 15% of their capacity at 0 degrees, 30% at -10, and 70% at -20. Winter can also eliminate the possibility of using drones at all, with overcast conditions and poor visibility all but rendering ultra-long distance observation moot. The same goes for more traditional air power and close air support commonly grounded in adverse conditions. Staying warm and dry is critical to stave off avoidable casualties from attriting cold, trench foot, frostbite, and hypothermia. This is what makes winter warfare so complicated. Soldiers require much more gear to maintain normal operations. New socks, lined winter boots, heaters, generators, gloves, and food, much more food. Anywhere up to 6,000 calories worth per day, depending on the levels of physical exertion. And all this stuff weighs a lot, taking up valuable transport space that might ordinarily be allocated to munitions, weapons, and other fighting equipment and people. There is one way to bypass some of winter's most compromising facets: regular troop rotation. Unfortunately, this is not a luxury either side enjoys. Russian conscripts will not be taken off the front lines anytime soon, consigned to fight within unfamiliar units lacking cohesion and training and good leadership. Ukrainians, already at a numerical disadvantage, are heroically holding territory regained in their autumn counteroffensives. Some will rotate to the rear to warm up, resupply and rest, but in areas of extreme fighting, reinforcements remain short. Ukraine's strategy has been to care for the soldiers it does field, providing them with as much enabling equipment as possible to attenuate the effects of winter. Russia's strategy, on the other hand, has been to throw more Mobics into the maelstrom, most sporting the latest Soviet militaria. Russia is increasingly fielding a late Soviet army, a 20th century army maybe with kit from the 1960s and 1970s, one Russian security expert observed, adding, "In those circumstances, I really don't see how Russia can make any major breakthroughs on the battlefield." What then can both sides hope to accomplish this winter? Putin will be keen to stalemate operations as much as he can, reversing the steady onslaught of Ukrainian successes and giving his troops time to amass munitions, deploy newly mobilized forces to the front, and prepare for renewed large-scale offensive operations in the spring. It's fair to assume that Ukraine will want to capitalize on recent successes by maintaining momentum, but Ukraine's top military commander, General Zaluzhny, has himself acknowledged that his forces may have to cede a degree of offensive initiative to prioritize other needs. "May the soldiers in the trenches forgive me," he said in a recent interview. "It's more important to focus on the accumulation of resources right now for the more protracted and heavier battles that may begin next year." Zaluzhny foresees these battles taking place in February and March, even late January, potentially far from the current lines in the east if Russia somehow manages to rekindle its offensive aims on Kyiv. Historically, hopes of a winter stalemate in Ukraine regularly failed to materialize. During World War II, winter offensives over this same battlefield were launched with baffling regularity, and Russian and German soldiers alike battled treacherous conditions in mud, rain, sleet, and snow, executing incredibly ambitious offensive operations. Frozen ground enabled much of the mechanized mobility behind these offensives, but they strained lines of communication and logistics to their absolute limit. This ability to supply and fuel forces in the field, more than arguably anything else, will be the defining factor in any offensive operations staged over the coming months. But the fighting is not likely to stop. Russian and Ukrainian veterans of past winter clashes in the Donbass and elsewhere since 2014 are savvy enough to know how to operate in cold weather environments. Whether they can bring the uninitiated mobilized personnel and volunteers filling the ranks around them up to speed remains to be seen. One thing is certain: winter attrition will wreak havoc on discipline, cohesion, and morale. It affects a vast spectrum of civilian and military activities. Rapid, immense adaptation and resilience will be required on a nationwide scale. Whoever adapts best will likely emerge from winter poised for further success. How do you think the winter war in Ukraine will unfold? Will Russia be able to maintain its discipline and cohesion? Can Ukraine hold on to its hard-fought gains? How will winter equipment and vehicles hold up under the harsh conditions? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.